You've probably heard the narrative 1,000 times by now. Tariffs were supposed to be the magic bullet. The promise was simple, almost seductive in its clarity. Slap heavy taxes on Chinese imports, make their goods too expensive, and watch as manufacturing jobs flood back to the Rust Belt, revitalizing the American middle class. It's early 2026, and if you look at your bank account, your grocery bill, or the price of simple electronics, you know that story hasn't exactly played out as advertised. There's a gnawing anxiety that many of us feel but few can pinpoint, a sense that despite all the tough talk, the trade wars, and the geopolitical posturing, the cost of living keeps climbing, while the promised factory boom remains a mirage. You might be asking yourself, if we are winning the trade war, why does everything cost so much more? And why, despite all the barriers we've erected, does it feel like our economic leverage is slipping? The uncomfortable truth is that the policy intended to protect American industry may have actually accelerated its dependence on a shadow network of global trade. Here is the reality check that Wall Street won't tell you because it complicates their investment thesis. China just posted a record-breaking trade surplus of $1.1 trillion. Let that number sink in. $1.1 trillion. This isn't just a victory lap, it is an economic earthquake. While Washington was busy celebrating tariff hikes and claiming they had strangled the Chinese export machine, the data shows the exact opposite happened. The tariffs didn't stop the flow of goods, they simply forced the water to find a new channel. We were told that decoupling was happening, that supply chains were coming home. But the hard data reveals a startling contradiction. US imports from places like Vietnam and Mexico have skyrocketed. Yet the trade deficit remains stubbornly high. Why? Because the goods entering American ports might say made in Vietnam on the sticker. But the components, the capital, and the profits are still flowing back to Beijing. We haven't cut the cord, we've just lengthened the extension cable. To understand how this happened, we need to strip away the political rhetoric and look at the mechanics of global logistics. This is where the concept of transshipment and substantial transformation comes into play. The loopholes that turn the trade war into a global shell game. Imagine you have a Lego set. If China ships the completed set to the US, it gets hit with a 60% tariff. But what if China ships the loose bricks to a factory in Vietnam? There, workers put the bricks in a box, maybe add a localized instruction manual, and slap a new label on it. Under current trade rules, if enough value is added in Vietnam, often just a coat of paint or simple assembly, that product legally becomes Vietnamese. It enters the US tariff free. This isn't illegal in many cases. It is a feature of the international rules of origin that China has masterfully exploited. They aren't just smuggling, they are engineering the supply chain to bypass the toll booth entirely. We are playing checkers, trying to block direct shipments, while they are playing 4D chess, moving goods through third-party proxies, faster than our bureaucrats can rewrite the rulebook. This strategy has triggered a brutal self-backfire loop for the American economy. The tariffs were meant to hurt Chinese exporters, but in a cruel twist of irony, they are punishing American manufacturers. How? By taxing the intermediate goods, the steel, the aluminum, the specialized electronic components that us factories need to build their products. When the cost of these raw materials skyrockets due to tariffs, American companies have two choices: eat the cost and lose profit, or raise prices and lose customers. Meanwhile, their Chinese competitors, who can now route their finished goods through Southeast Asia tariff-free, don't face these input cost spikes. We have created an inverted tariff environment where it is cheaper to import a finished air conditioner from a Chinese-owned factory in Thailand than it is to import the parts to build that same air conditioner in Ohio. The policy designed to save American manufacturing is effectively suffocating it by raising its operating costs, driving over 1 million jobs not back to America, but to these intermediate zones like Vietnam and Malaysia. To truly grasp the scale of this, we have to look at the history of China's industrial evolution. 10 years ago, the strategy was made in China. Today, the strategy is managed by China. Facing rising wages at home and hostility abroad, Beijing didn't just sit there, they activated the China Plus One strategy. They proactively moved low-end, labor-intensive assembly lines to Southeast Asia while keeping the high-value, high-tech component manufacturing at home. Think of it like a spider web. The center of the web, the complex machinery, the chemical processing, the injection molding, remains in Guangdong or Jiangsu. The outer strands, the final assembly, are in Hanoi or Bangkok. US import data shows a massive drop in direct Chinese goods, which looks like a win for tariffs. But look closer at Vietnam's import data. Their imports of Chinese components have exploded in perfect correlation with their exports to the US. This proves that Vietnam hasn't replaced China. Vietnam is simply the final assembly floor for China's factory. The dependency hasn't been broken, it has been obscured. We are no longer dependent on China for the final product, but we are dependent on a supply chain where China controls every critical upstream node. This circumvention isn't just about moving boxes, it is about a technological takeover of global logistics. China has spent the last decade building the physical and digital infrastructure to make this rerouting seamless. They aren't just using Vietnamese ports, Chinese state-owned enterprises are building them. They are financing the roads, the power grids, and the digital customs systems in these transshipment hubs. This allows them to coordinate the flow of goods with a precision that American logistics companies struggle to match. By utilizing advanced data analytics and port automation, Chinese firms can pivot shipments in real time. If the US threatens tariffs on solar panels from Malaysia, they can shift the final assembly to Cambodia or Laos within weeks. This agile manufacturing capability means that the physical constraints the US tries to impose are rendered obsolete by the sheer fluidity of China's logistics network. They have successfully decoupled the flow of goods from the flow of political consequences. Furthermore, this dominance is anchored in the ground itself. We often forget that manufacturing requires raw materials, and here, China plays a long game that the West has largely ignored. From rare earth minerals essential for EV batteries to the gallium used in advanced radar systems, China controls the processing choke points. Even if a factory moves to Mexico to serve the US market under the USMCA trade deal, that factory is likely still dependent on processed lithium or refined cobalt that can only be sourced at scale from China. This is the strategic reserve that makes the trade war so lopsided. You can tariff a laptop, but you can't easily tariff the monopoly on the specific refined elements inside it without crippling your own tech sector. China has built a vertical integration that spans from the mine shaft to the shipping container. By controlling the raw inputs, they ensure that no matter where the final product is assembled, be it Monterrey or Mumbai, the profit margins eventually flow back to the entities controlling the resources. This brings us to the geopolitical dimension, the risk of American isolation. By weaponizing trade tariffs, the US has inadvertently pushed Southeast Asia and the Global South closer to Beijing. Through agreements like the RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, China has integrated these nations into its economic orbit, creating a frictionless trade zone that excludes the United States. While Washington demands that countries choose sides, Beijing offers them infrastructure investment and supply chain integration. The result is that countries like Vietnam, Thailand, and Indonesia are becoming economically tethered to China. They rely on Chinese inputs to produce the exports that drive their economies. The more the US leans on tariffs, the more lucrative it becomes for these nations to act as China's backdoor. We are witnessing the formation of a shadow supply chain, a global network that operates parallel to Western institutions, designed specifically to absorb and neutralize US economic statecraft. However, there is a darker, more insidious cost to this efficiency, the laundering of forced labor. One of the primary goals of recent US trade policy, specifically the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, was to ban goods made with slave labor. But transshipment creates a black hole for ethical enforcement. Cotton harvested in Xinjiang can be shipped to a textile mill in Bangladesh, turned into fabric, sent to Vietnam for sewing, and labeled Made in Vietnam. By the time that shirt reaches a US port, the paper trail of the original raw material has been washed clean. This is the moral hazard of the loophole. By focusing on the country of origin for the finished good, rather than the entire supply chain, the current tariff regime inadvertently incentivizes the obfuscation of labor abuses. American consumers are buying goods that they believe are ethically sourced, unaware that the lower price tag is subsidized by human rights violations, buried 3 layers deep in the supply chain. Looking at this through a reverse lens, we must consider the uncomfortable possibility that the trade war was actually a blessing in disguise for China. In crisis management, there is a concept that external pressure forces internal evolution. By cutting off easy access to the US market for low-end goods, the tariffs forced Chinese manufacturers to upgrade their technology and move up the value chain faster than they otherwise would have. It was a Darwinian moment for Chinese industry. Only the most efficient, high-tech, and adaptable firms survived. They automated, they innovated, and they diversified their markets to the Global South and Europe. Instead of crushing their industry, the pressure cooked away the fat and left a leaner, meaner manufacturing base that is now competing directly with Western firms in high-tech sectors like EVs and renewable energy. We tried to starve the beast, but we ended up training it to hunt better. Of course, we must remain objective and recognize the risks Beijing still faces. The US government is not blind. The Bureau of Customs and Border Protection is slowly waking up to this reality. We are seeing a shift from blanket tariffs to targeted investigations into circumvention, particularly in the solar and steel sectors. But this enforcement is a game of whack-a-mole. For every loophole the US closes, two more open up. The sheer volume of trade millions of containers a year makes 100% enforcement impossible without causing a total economic standstill. Moreover, there is a lag time. It takes Washington years to investigate and rule on a trade violation. It takes a Chinese supply chain manager days to reroute a shipment. This temporal asymmetry means that regulation will always be chasing innovation, and in the world of global trade, speed is the only currency that matters. So, what is the path forward? If tariffs are a blunt instrument that misses the target, the US needs a surgical approach. We are likely to see a shift in 2026 and 2027 towards supply chain visibility laws, requiring companies to prove the origin of every component, not just the final assembly location. The buzzword is moving from near-shoring to friend-shoring, building alliances with countries that share political values and transparency standards. But this is a monumental task. It requires rebuilding the entire industrial base of the West, a process that takes decades, not election cycles. Until the US can offer a viable alternative to the Chinese supply chain ecosystem, one that offers comparable speed, scale, and cost, the tariffs will remain little more than a tax on the American consumer, collected at the border and paid at the register. Let's circle back to that $1.1 trillion number. It stands as a monolithic testament to the failure of a containment strategy based on outdated assumptions. It proves that capital, like water, always flows to where resistance is lowest and efficiency is highest. The tariffs didn't bring the jobs back because they didn't address the underlying reason the jobs left: the lack of a comprehensive industrial ecosystem in the US. We focused on the price tag while China focused on the process. They built a machine so integrated, so flexible, and so massive that it can absorb a 60% tariff and still turn a profit by simply changing the return address. The victory here isn't moral or political. It is a cold, hard victory of logistics and economic adaptability. This leaves us with a difficult question, and I want to hear your take on this in the comments. We are at a crossroads between economic nationalism and global reality. Are you willing to pay significantly higher prices, perhaps 30% or 40% more for cars, phones, and clothes, to genuinely cut China out of the supply chain? Or do we accept that the global economy is too intertwined to ever truly unravel, and that these Made in Vietnam labels are a necessary illusion to keep inflation down? Is it better to have the illusion of independence with cheap goods, or the reality of independence with a lower standard of living? Let me know what you think the right move is.